Aloha! Welcome back. I'm back in my dorm room, and we're just going to ignore the fact that I chose to wear this shirt today to conceal my horrific sunburn lines, because I've been going to a lot of beaches lately, and no matter how much sunscreen I put on, the sun in Hawaii always wins. Always. So. Lately, I've been going to a lot of beaches, but I've kind of only had one thing on my mind, and that is the impending doom of finals. And I'm sure that a lot of other college students feel the same way. Just, they're right there, we're so close. I mean, I've only got a month left, and while I'm like high-key freaking out about the fact that I only have a month left here, and I'm trying to soak everything in, I'm also like, oh my god, I have like 20 to 30 pages of writing that I need to do in the next month. Too blessed to be stressed. That's what I keep telling myself. Yikes. So I've talked about my classes a lot already. I'm taking kind of like 5.5. I'm taking geology, like intro geology. A Hawaiian studies class called the Hawaiian Ohana. I'm taking literature of Hawaii, modern Hawaiian culture after 1819, which is an anthropology class, and Japanese immigrants, which is also an anthropology class. And while I've talked about them a lot, I kind of wanted to talk about them again in a more retrospective way, like now that I'm most of the way through the semester, kind of like looking back and like thinking about what I've learned. And I thought the best way to do that would be like kind of going through some of the stuff I've read and talking about that and creating a kind of like must-read guide for, you know, Hawaii in general. I mean, I feel like, yeah. We kind of have looked at other lists like this in my English class, Literature of Hawaii, but mine is going to be a lot shorter, and you have to take it with a grain of salt, of course, because, you know, I've only read so much. I can only read so much in a semester, but I've done a lot. So anyways, lots to talk about. Let's get right into it. If you read nothing else about Hawaii, read Haunani K. Trask. From a Native Daughter is basically a book-long essay about colonization, and not just in Hawaii, but like all of the Pacific. I'm not all the way, I'm like a little less than half the way through it, because I actually didn't read this for a class. I kind of read it more in like an extracurricular way. My English professor gave this book to me because he thought it was so important, and he thought it was so important for me to read it. And so I've just been like slowly working through it, and from what I've read so far, it's like incredible. Haunani K. Trask is an activist for Hawaiian sovereignty. She was really active in the 90s, and her writing gets a lot of backlash because it's really extreme in the position it takes on how she classifies locals, and like locals versus like indigenous Hawaiian people. And she also has books of poetry, collections of poetry, but she's mostly known for her essays and her critical writing. She writes about a lot of different things. But yeah, this is like a really important book in my opinion. And just like my English professor gave this book to me to read because he thought it was really important, I think that everybody everywhere, whether you've been to Hawaii, whether you've never been, should read this book, because the way that Trask talks about indigeneity and colonization is a good way to understand the way that those forces work in the rest of the United States and the rest of the world. It's just a good kind of baseline. Read her work. From a Native Daughter specifically. Very good. To get a decent grasp on Hawaiian history, I recommend a book that I read for my Modern Hawaiian Culture after 1819 class. I don't have like a physical copy of it. I have it on my laptop. I think it's generally out of print, but you can get it at the Bishop Museum or the Bishop Museum's website probably. It's called Native Lands and Foreign Desires, and the author's last name is Kume'e Lahiba. yeah, it's a really good book. It outlines everything from when Kamehameha ascended to the paramount chief position that he kind of created. He united all of the islands. So it starts with that, and it ends up at a little bit after the Great Mahele, which for those who don't know, the Great Mahele, great meaning size, not quality of the Mahele, was the privatization of land ownership in Hawaii. So after a constitutional government was created, a lot of the missionaries who had put themselves in this new government were like, you need to own land. You can't just share it, and you can't like have this land tenure system that you already have in place. You have to adopt land ownership if you want to even be close to successful like the United States is. And so there was this whole process, and a lot of people didn't get to claim land because of the way that the process was set up. It was basically designed to fail. So a lot of people got like cheated out of land and booted off their land that they had been living on for generations and generations. That was a really big deal for Hawaiian people, and it affects a lot of what goes on today with land rights. Like there's currently quieting land titles issue on the island of Kauai. Mark Zuckerberg is trying to buy up a bunch of land, and there's like a little chunk of land that's owned by a family in the middle of what he wants to buy up. So these issues are still relevant, and a good way to learn about them is through Kame'elehiwa's reading. I have learned a lot, and I wish that everyone else on the exchange program here with me got to read that book, because it's very detailed. It comes from like a Hawaiian, it brings like Hawaiian cultural ideas into historical explanation and historical interpretation, which I think is really good. And then the other thing that I recommend if you want to look at Hawaiian history, Hawaiian culture, is anything by this woman named Mary Kavena Pukui or Martha Beckwith. They both did a lot of work compiling Hawaiian mythology, the Hawaiian language, Hawaiian traditions, and working with people to put those into print so that the culture wouldn't die during like the 40s and 50s, when there was a lot of like assimilation going on. People were very the tourism industry was kind of on the rise, and so that culture was sliding away. This is the book that we use in my Ohana class. It's called The Polynesian Family System, and it's by Mary Kavena Pukui. And this actually has like a lot of information, not just about family structures, but also about like the way like houses were set up, and what each house's function was, and seasons, and why they were named what they were, and basic information about gods and goddesses in Hawaiian mythology. So it's a good book if you want like a really good overview. But yeah, generally anything by those two authors is pretty legit, and yeah, would recommend. Okay, I also don't have a copy of this one because we just read a little bit of it in my Literature of Hawaii class, but I'm sure this is what everybody was waiting to hear. I think people should read James Michener's Hawaii. And notice I didn't say Hawaii, I said Hawaii, because he, in his title, he didn't put an okina between the two I's. So it literally is just Hawaii. Hawaii. It's not correct. I think in today's kind of like social and political climates, it's pretty easy to see what's wrong with James Michener's work, and to read it with like a really critical eye. But I still think it's a really important baseline for understanding literature that was written after that book came out. It came out a couple months after Hawaii became a state. And it kind of has that vibe, you know, like it like posits that people, all the different types of people that live in Hawaii are at their core, they are also American. And that's the kind of work it sets out to do from the beginning. So I think that it is important to read to understand the later books. It's a good way to, if you want to see a really bad version of Hawaiian Creole English, really incorrect Hawaiian Creole English, Missioner's the way to go. If you want to see a really heavily stereotyped depiction of a Hawaiian guy, of a Chinese guy, of a Japanese guy, of a Filipino, like, he's got everyone in there, and they're all walking stereotypes. So it's good to read, because a lot of works that come after are kind of like responding and like trying to correct that book. So it's a good baseline. And speaking of that, the next 4 books that I want to talk about are all correctives, and I think they're really important. So this first one is called All I Asking For Is My Body. Now, all I'm asking for is my body. All I asking for is my body. And it's by a guy named Milton Murayama. It was also published in 1959 after Missioner's Hawaii came out. Or actually, it wasn't published in 1959. It was written in 1959, and Murayama couldn't get anyone to publish it, so it wasn't published until 1975. But because it was written in 1959, it's clearly a response to Missioner, and you can see that in the way it's written too. Like the way that Murayama uses pidgin in this book, the way that he, so for example, in Missioner's book, there's a Japanese character who comes back from World War II, and he has like proven that he's an American because he fought in World War II, and he fought for the Americans. And in this book, it stops before the main character can go to war. Like he signs up, he volunteers, but before he even leaves Hawaii, the book ends. And I think that's like a really poignant kind of contrast. Anyways, it's really lovely. It's a quick read, and you learn a lot about Japanese immigration. I found it really relevant for my Japanese immigrants class too. We didn't read it for that class, but I brought it up several times in class, and it definitely helped in discussion. Both of these books are really incredible. I'm not going to suggest that you read both. I would say one or the other, because they're both kind of hard to read. Especially Blues Hanging, there's some disturbing stuff in it. But yeah, so this is The Tattoo by Chris McKinney, and this is Blues Hanging by Lois Ann Yamanaka. And they're both stories about Japanese immigrant descendants. The Tattoo takes place on Oahu, and it's a frame narrative. So, the frame is that there's 2 guys in prison, and one is telling the other his story about how he got to prison, but it ends up being his life story. Yeah, it's really good. It sticks with you. It makes you think about it. And then Blues Hanging is way more rough than The Tattoo. It's a story about 3 children on Molokai whose mother has died. And they are very poor, and the oldest sister has to kind of step up and be a parent at a very young age. Her father still works on the plantation, and just, it talks so much about racial tension. It kind of brings up the same themes that Chris McKinney does, but in a more violent and graphic way. And it's just really beautifully written. Yamanaka is also a poet, and it shows. It's a really beautifully written book. It's borderline tear-jerking. But again, if you're not ready to read about some disturbing stuff and see Hawaii in a more frank way, then I don't recommend this. But in general, I do. Like, I really recommend all of these texts. For anybody who's trying to understand colonization, for anybody who's trying to understand the relationship between Indigenous people and local people in Hawaii, all of these books are helpful. And then last but not least is this book. It's giant. It's called In the Time Before Light by Ian McMillan. We also read this for my English class. And it was like the first thing that we read. I've read it all before the first day of class because he sent out an email, our professor sent out an email and said, read it. It's long. It's like 450 pages long, but it is beautiful. And I personally think it gives you like a really, like, I knew nothing about Hawaiian culture before I came here, and this gave me a really good basic outline. Like, I learned what kapu was from this book. Again, this book it's got some gore, some violence in it, so if you are kind of squeamish, maybe not, but it's beautifully written. It teaches you a lot about, again, Hawaiian history, how things came to be the way that they are, and I feel like everything we read in the semester, from like Trask to Murayama to all that stuff, it all is like culminating in this book, which was published most recently out of the stuff that I've read. And like all of the stuff that I've been talking about in all of my classes, it's kind of like, this is like almost the result. Like, this is the end game here. Or like the result of all of this like literary history. So those things are really good if you want to get a good idea of Hawaiian history and Hawaiian culture in a very like candid way. You can read one of those, you can read all of them. I don't recommend just reading one. I recommend reading several